My dog, the bigger one anyway, will do big yawns and sometimes snaps her jaw shut. It sounds like she's being aggressive. I'm like, okay, some mixed messages there.
Oh,
But
wow. And Cameron, you have a dog too, right?
I do. His name is Martin. He's a little scruffy guy. I love him a lot.
So cute. I liked in your bio that he has a soul of a human man.
Yeah, I I don't really know how to describe it. Tim, maybe you can vouch for the fact that that feels
Yeah, no,
accurate.
I've met
Uh,
him. He has a profound understanding of like dynamics,
yeah,
but
he understands the concept of like incarceration, you know?
yeah,
Oh
and
my
like
Yeah.
and
gosh.
like yeah, he's like I shouldn't be in here or I should be over there or like why is this dog allowed to be in this office with me at the same time? But he got dog sat once by one of our colleagues who I think yeah referred to him like just as a little man like like she was like oh yeah I dog sat him but like it was just like being around a little guy. His I think uh Cameron and company they taught him how to ask a question like how to ask for something and I think that was maybe like by generating like a question they also
Yeah.
generated desire and
Do you use
curiosity.
those buttons, that are all over
yes,
TikTok?
yeah, yeah.
We it was so I parent Martin with two of my best friends and we had pretty involved discussions about getting buttons, but if you give a communication tool to an animal, you really can't take it away. It's
Yeah.
very unethical to remove it. So we weren't sure that that was something we wanted to invest in, but yeah, if he wants something and we can tell that he wants something, he will come and poke us with his paw or with his nose. And if he's demanding something in a way like he's barking really loudly or he's just like being a little we'll say, "Oh, Martin asked," and then he'll come and he'll reluctantly like, ugh. Um,
That's
but yeah,
a
I do think it is a little bit of a Pandora's box of like, did he have existential desires before
Yeah,
we
did
gave
you
that to him?
introduce
I
him
don't know.
to
Yeah,
a
I don't know.
concept that
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
he can never go back.
no.
Well, not to derail our conversation, but we're now at the 5 minute mark. So we'll go ahead and get started for our audience here. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining BRIC's Animation, Visual Effects, and Gaming Pre-Apprenticeship Speaker Series. I'm Sarah, BRIC's Director of Communications and your moderator. And the speaker series from the BRIC Foundation aims to give you an inside look at the variety of careers that exist across animation, VFX, and gaming industries. Today, we're focusing on narrative design for games, and we'll talk more about the skills you need to know and all of the ways that you can really tell an authentic story through characters and gameplay. And as always, we welcome you, our audience, to ask questions. So please make sure to submit any questions you might have along the way using that Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll be dedicating the last 15 minutes of the session to answering your questions. So definitely make sure to use that feature. And with that, I'm very excited to welcome officially our panel of experts here on narrative design. We have Evan Narcisse, who is the senior writer and narrative designer at Brass Lion Entertainment. Kim Belair, who is the writer, narrative designer, and CEO of Sweet Baby Inc. And also Camerin Wild, who is a writer at Sweet Baby Inc. with Kim. So I'd love to turn it over to each of you to tell us more about your career journey. How did you get to where you are now? What led you to narrative design? What interests you in about this field? And Evan, we'll start with you. I know you're a very versatile storyteller and writer who's worked in comics, video games, film, TV, editorial media. How did you kind of land on narrative design?
Yeah, so I have a very like classic archetypal nerd story. I was like a shy, bookish kid who was introverted, like learned to read off comics and always loved video games. And I got like the itch, about probably midway through high school to like try and write professionally. Like that was an idea that I could never let go. My mom had other plans for me, which I tried to fulfill, and failed. But you know, when I was in college, I took a course in journalism, and that professor wound up being an early mentor of mine. And he's like, "You can write. You should pursue this." So I wound up minoring in journalism at school, and I found like, yeah, I liked to ask questions and hear people's answers, and I had a journalism career for about 2 decades, and during the course of that, I started writing about video games and comic books, the things I was passionate about, and became a cultural critic and journalist who covered those areas. And about, gosh, 7 years ago at this point, um, the company I was working at offered me a buyout and I said, "Hey, I'm going to try and pursue this full time for real." So I started becoming a narrative design consultant, and we can get into what that is in a little bit. But basically, I found that the skills I had been using in journalism also helped me in other kinds of writing and other kinds of media, right? Like, how does a person find their place in the world? How do they reckon with like the systems and infrastructure that allows them to do or not do certain things? I was always concerned about like representation in video games and other cultural forms I was writing about. So like it very much wound up being the same tools used for different tasks. So and once I started, comics actually came first. Once I started writing comics, other opportunities came to me to write for Marvel and DC and other entities. And yeah, that's kind of how I got my start. And currently at Brass Lion, I'm one of the writers and the designers working on a game that we're making. Kim and Cameron both work on it in a consulting capacity. Their help's invaluable, and we can talk more about what it means to be inside a studio like I am and consulting like these guys are. But yeah, that's basically the entirely too long, but not long enough recap of how I got here.
Awesome. And Kim, I know you have about a decade's worth of experience in the industry
Yes.
as well. So let us know
Yeah.
what your career path has looked like.
Yeah, I started in 2013. My background, I've always been like someone who's taken to writing. I've done a lot of like writing in my past. I've done a lot of creative fiction. I worked on a couple little comics, web comics and stuff like that. But I was always focused just kind of on what I can convey with words, which landed me at the time in marketing. I got my degree in marketing, and I ended up working kind of in brand. And one of my specialties at the time was figuring out like brand voice. Like what does this sound like? Hey, if Tostitos is talking, what do they sound like? And so I ended up doing a lot of that, but it always kind of skewed a little bit narrative. And so I ended up going over to Ubisoft in 2013. They kind of called me in to start working on community stuff, and I was a community developer, which is we are the ones who create the content that goes out to the community managers to disseminate. And naturally, I immediately turned that into a writing gig as well. I was like, maybe I could tell some stories. Maybe I could write a blog in the voice of a fictional character, things like this. And so through that, I was asked to join the Far Cry 4 team back in 2014 as well. And then I think I did a little bit of writing on that, but my first real project was Assassin's Creed Syndicate in, I think, 2015. That was my first writing gig. And then since then, I worked on a bunch of Ubisoft games, and then I kind of realized that within the structure of that company, I didn't see necessarily a place for myself, and I wanted to work on a lot of different projects at the same time, but naturally you're not allowed to do you're allowed to do that when you're working for one company. You can't just go like, oh, I'm kind of bored of this. I'm gonna go look at this for a day. And so I eventually parted ways with them. I went freelance for about a year, and then joining on with some friends, we realized that we really loved the work of writing. We loved working on projects. We loved narrative design, narrative development of all kinds. And we loved working with different teams. And whenever we worked with, as freelancers, whenever we worked with really nice teams, we found that the results were often better, that the game itself was better, or the project that we were working on. And so we ended up saying like, oh, well, those people were such sweet babies to work with. And we decided to start a company called Sweet Baby in honor of the kinds of people that we wanted to continue working with, because we really like collaboration for us is our bread and butter. So that was in 2018, 2019 that we founded Sweet Baby, and we're now about 6 years old. We've worked on nearly 100 projects, ranging from AAA, like Spider-Man 2 and Alan Wake 2 and God of War 2, the twos. We were in a lot of sequels. And then also some indie projects, recently Afterlove EP, and a while back a game called Sable. And then we have a bunch of unannounced and announced games still yet to emerge. So we've got a lot of expertise under our belts, and the vast majority of it is in kind of writing, consultation, story development, representational stuff. And for some folks, just to kind of wrap this up, some folks may have heard of us through the very loud hate campaign that was waged against us for about the past year and a half as a result of a lot of our work and because of the people that we are. And that is it is not necessarily the part of my story that I feel like I love to start the intro with this, but I think it's a reality that a lot of people have found out about us through that channel. And so hello to anyone who has, and I'm keen to talk more about what we actually do.
All right. And last but not least, Cameron, can you let us know how you got into narrative design and what your journey looked like?
Yeah, so I came to it quite a bit later than I think Kim did, but probably had a similar trajectory in terms of time to Evan. I straight out of I'm in Quebec, so we have CEGEP, which is kind of like a couple of years to faff around after high school. But then when I went to university, I actually did a degree in Japanese and in religious studies because I thought, like that, why not? I thought maybe I'll be a translator. And then religious studies, I think, was just pursuing an interest there. Always liked philosophy and liberal arts was something that I had studied before. And I fell into a job actually at a software company. So neither of those things really got applied for a very, very long time. I was working there for about, all told, about 9 years with a little bit of a break in between. And I knew that I wanted to do something creative. I was the, kind of kid who like would make their own comic books, and no one will ever find it, but wrote fan fiction and that kind of stuff. And so I was someone who really loved storytelling. And so I left my job at the software company and I went to film school thinking, oh, okay, maybe this is an industry where I can feel a part of the process in a way that I would like to. And I found in the end that it wasn't really, at least not at that time. There were things about it I enjoyed. I worked as a sound recordist for a little while, and that was like really nerdy and cool, and I liked that a lot. But in terms of getting to practice the art of storytelling, I was feeling a little bit frustrated. So came back to Montreal, back to the software company, which was like very comfortable, great place to work, but again, not very creative. And that was still kind of eating away at me, just the sense that, oh, I should be doing something that is applying this skill that I think I have. So I looked around and found a course here in Montreal that's about 8 weeks, and it's a writing incubator for people who are marginalized. To help them get into the industry. And I was thinking, okay, this is something that I know that I can do. It's a skill that probably I can top up pretty quickly. I didn't want to go back to school at that time. So I did that. It was like on evenings and weekends. And then at the showcase is actually where I met Kim and a couple of other of the founders of Sweet Baby, and we hit it off and kept in touch for a couple of years. And then when a contract came up that they thought I would be well suited for, they hit me up and were like, hey, would you like to give this a shot? And I was like, oh yeah. So that was my first writing job in the industry. And it was really affirming because I had, there were a lot of assignments that I had done. I've done game jams. So it's not like I had never written a single word for a video game before, but being able to kind of like test whether I could skate for the first time on the ice was was really validating. And that was back in 2019-ish, 2020. And so I've been working there ever since. And yeah, I've really enjoyed getting to see all different stages of game development. So sometimes we come on at the very beginning of a project and, we're involved in ideating and creating characters and doing a lot of world building, and then other times we're brought in at the very end when all of that stuff has been done and they're kind of wondering, okay, well, it's not quite fitting together. How do we stitch it together so that it makes sense? And throughout that, there's often, loads of documents that we're producing, a lot of script writing, a lot of story notes. So it's been a really great way to understand how effective game stories are put together. Yeah.
That's awesome. I love that little preview of all the different aspects, and we'll get into that too as we go on in this panel. But I did want to rewind just a little bit and set the context for what is narrative design. And what I'm hearing from all of your backgrounds is that there is this common thread of like, you enjoy storytelling, you've enjoyed writing. It's always been this like kind of persistent interest throughout your life. That's common among you three. I think a big question that we had talked about earlier too is a lot of people think narrative design is writing. So I'm wondering, maybe Kim or Evan, can you give us kind of an overview of what narrative design is, and how does it really differ from writing specifically?
I can start because I think we're both gonna have very similar answers. But for me, the writing is the writing. It is the words that people are saying. It is the kind of item description that you're reading. It is the objective that is being told to you. It's literally like the script writing or any of the copywriting that exists in the game. And I think the way I usually describe narrative design is that if we have the story that is being told, narrative design allows us to figure out how to tell it. So it is the difference between, in this section, the character will be walking and crouching and hiding because we want to make the player feel the tension of this moment in the story. In this section, we're going to give the player unlimited ammo because we want them to feel very, very powerful in this moment, or we're going to let them fly or soar. Those are choices that we make in the story, and there's words that are going to be coming out of the characters' mouths when we say it, but kind of adding those different elements of playability to different feelings or moments in the story, to me, is narrative design. I think of it as the mechanical expression of story in a game versus the written expression of story in a game.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, Kim kind of said it all. I don't have a lot to say outside of that, but I will add that, like, you know, we because of the field we work in, we talk about narrative design in terms of like gameplay and what does a button press mean, right? What does it mean when you dodge? Like, what should the character say? How should the enemies react? And that's a holistic kind of narrative design that isn't just in the hands of narrative designers, but you have to work with people who do animation, who do the level designs. We're always talking to people in different disciplines on a project because every everything you see on screen should have the ability to express story or relate to the themes of the game you're playing or experiencing. So it's not just writing. And something I've heard and adopted along the way along the journey of my career is that narrative design is about what the player experiences, and story is about what the character experiences, right? So, like, the story is like, okay, Mario goes down a warp pipe and he has to kill a couple of Goombas and so on and so forth. The narrative design is that, okay, we're going to take the player from above ground to underground. We're going to introduce new enemies in these steps. And all that stuff is generally very thought out with a lot of intention. And narrative design is about making sure that storytelling um, moves through all those different elements. And
Those are important
you
things.
experience the narrative design in other forms too.
Yes.
Like I write comics, and when I started writing comics, um, I didn't think about the page turn, right? So, like, what happens in the last panel before the next page, that's a design decision, right? Like, I'm gonna break up a sentence, have it like be dot 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 ellipses, and then that'll make you turn the page to the next page. Or like the character will ask a question, where is Superman anyway? And then you turn the page, like, there he is, he's in the first panel. Like, so it's like thinking about those transitions and the flow of story is narrative design. And you don't have to be it doesn't have to be interactive. There's narrative design all around us. what we talk about in a specific way in games.
I was going to say I once did a talk at a conference where I explained narrative design through wrestling because I think professional wrestling is one of our biggest I think venues for pure narrative design when it comes to that kind of storytelling because we understand that wrestling has stories, we understand it has characters, but they're not always going to be talking. They don't have an unlimited range of
No,
things they
yeah,
can do. It's not like they can go like, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to drive this car here and I'm going to do that. No, they have a certain move set. They have a move set that they can use in the ring and sometimes out of it if that's gonna break the rules. They have a certain theme that plays when they show up so that people know how to respond. You can tell by the way that someone moves whether they're good or evil, and no matter how complex or bizarre the problem they're solving, you know exactly the mechanism by which they're going to solve it. It's going to be wrestling. Like no matter what, at the end of the day, it's going to be wrestling. And I think that for me is one of the best illustrations of what it feels like to be a narrative designer. Because there's a question in the chat that is, are game mechanics decided before you are involved? And the answer is often yes. I would say that like that's by no means a rule. There are some times where will be somewhere like early enough in the process to kind of help with those. But for the most part, you know what kind of game you're going to make at the beginning. You're not going to go like, is it going to be open world or not? Like you know you're going to have a certain amount of tools. And so that's a huge part of what you're thinking about because it might be nice if you're making a first person shooter, it might be nice to have your character, explain the reasons that non-violence are actually superior. But if you do that, you're going to be like, well, we're not really playing much of a game. So when you're designing that story, you know, like it's going to have to come to a firefight at this point, the same way you know it's going to have to come to wrestling at this point. And so I always think about those as kind of the limitations that we're working with and the way that design and story kind of intersect.
That's a great explanation. And thank you, because I didn't know that either. And I love that metaphor of wrestling to narrative design. We talked about how narrative design can come in at the beginning of a pipeline at the concepting phase. But Cameron, I know you also mentioned that you guys can come in as consultants towards the end of a production as well. How does narrative design really fit in to the production? Does it vary all the time? What is that like?
So I think as a broad concept, narrative design is always present. Even if there is no stated narrative designer on the project, if it's a game designer and a lead programmer or something, narrative design is still happening. So that doesn't necessarily mean that it is being actively talked about, but everything, as both Kim and Evan have mentioned, everything feeds into what the player experiences, the sequence in which they experience it, the method in which they experience it, the medium, all that, the verbs in which they're able to act in the world, all of that contributes to the narrative design. So I think it's helpful for people who are in any department to realize that they're part of the story team. Everybody is part of the story team, basically. But I would say in our experience, the best projects typically start to talk about that pretty early because you want to make sure that the kind of characters, the kind of storylines, the kind of mechanics, the kind of world are all supporting each other, that there isn't one that's kind of veering off in its own direction and messing up the vibe. So I would say that it varies in reality as to when people really start to get serious about narrative design. Certainly, if we're brought in late into a project, it's already something that has been to a certain extent baked in, and the changes that we're making are much more surgical. So, if there's uh, we're brought into to comment on the narrative of a platformer. We're not going to say, hey, actually, platforming doesn't suit this story at all. Or if we do, we're going to say it in a way where it's like, okay, so we realize there's a bit of a dissonance here. How can we bring this together so that it makes more of a coherent experience for the player? But again, yeah, I would say that the more that you can pay attention to how you as a player are absorbing story and what pieces you've noticed have, when you've synthesized them in your mind, built that story, the more you're aware of that, the better you'll be at narrative design, whether you decide to be a quote unquote narrative designer or not.
I see a lot
I
of shaking
don't know if
heads.
that
Kim,
answered the
Evan,
question or
anything to
not.
add to that as well?
Okay.
No, I think there's enthusiastic nodding. I think because I feel like that's really it. It's so much of narrative design on a technical level is accomplished by understanding verbs and understanding like what the limits of your ability are. But for me, so much of what narrative design is in the kind of like generation phase is just vibes. Like it is very much like the gut of storytelling. It's why doesn't this feel satisfying in this moment? Why is the character exhilarated and I am completely not? Why is the character afraid and I'm not? There are so many, yeah, there are so many moments that for me just come down to does it feel good when you're playing it, and the kind of like the synthesis between how it feels and how we're gripping it and what we're actually thinking about. Because I know it is silly, but I often like I will picture myself quote unquote like on the sticks playing often when I'm thinking about like my way through a scene, because just doing that helps me to kind of not just think, okay, what am I trying to write, but what am I trying to experience?
Awesome. Evan, anything you wanted to add to that as well?
No, let's keep going.
Awesome. Okay. Well, I know as part what makes a narrative designer so successful is that like teamwork, that collaboration, that communication that we were talking about. What are some other hard or soft skills that would make someone successful in this type of role or this type of team? And that's a question for anyone to take.
Collaboration and persistence and enough humility to acquiesce to a good idea, but enough, I think, confidence to push forward on your own. I think that the big one for me on any game team is collaboration across the board, because no work is done in a vacuum. And in fact, the worst game projects are the times when you go like, oh, someone's been siloed on this thing or these teams aren't communicating. But the importance of collaboration narrative design is huge, because if I think, oh, it would be really cool for XYZ to happen, I need to sync with the level designer to make sure that we agree on how it should feel to navigate the space. I have to talk to the art team, because if I'm saying, okay, this is a haunted and scary space, I don't want them to go like, okay, cool, I'm going to do kind of sci-fi horror and make it like kind of bright, shiny, and sleek, because those ideas might both be horror, but I need to really collaborate to make sure we're on the same page. And even there in one of the Assassin's Creed games that I worked on in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, we had this one scene where the main character Eivor is going to face off against like a challenger from her own clan. And throughout that, like I was actually just working with the combat team, because we had a thought that we were like, okay, in the beginning of the fight, he should really come at you, but then when it's clear you're winning, you should feel bad about it. And so thinking through the narrative design of, well, how do you make, if you just have a certain amount of fight mechanics, how do you make someone feel kind of bad that you're fighting him? And so we said, okay, let's break his arm. So let's have it so that part of the way through the fight, he's not able to do this anymore. He's one-handed and he's kind of being a little more guarded. Nothing has changed for the player meaningfully, but all of a sudden he just looks a little worse. He was never using his other, like, truth be told, that character was actually never using a hand. It's just an animation that looks really cool. But by dropping that animation, we suddenly go, oh no, this is sad that what we're doing to him, and it's a tragic moment instead. And I feel like things like that are a testament to just I couldn't have done that by myself, because I just could have written the lines of her going, oh, he seems sad, or like, oh, I hate to do this. But being able to say no in combat, they said, yeah, we can do 3 or 4 things to change the feel of this battle, and all of a sudden it's a story.
That's a really great example. I love that. And also it's a testament to understanding empathy too, right? Is understanding how emotions work and how
Yes.
you can be able to modify and use all those levers, at your disposal to make that feeling, that vibe, come across. Evan, did you have anything to add to that as well?
I'm gonna throw to Cameron here, not because I don't have an answer, but I want to make sure Cameron gets to jump in here so I don't steal anything they might say.
I think it's been said. Yeah, I think that what I have learned the most is being able to translate my ideas into other languages for other disciplines. Um, the things that get a writer excited are not necessarily the things that get a concept artist excited. They can be, but I think it's important to really take some time, especially as if you're, starting out at a new company or in a new role, to, as much as possible, unobtrusively like listen in on the conversations other departments are having and understand the things that they're excited about, because that'll be the best way um to get people on your side if there's a particular idea that you really love.
I love that concept of really understanding who you're working with and, how they communicate so that you can more effectively be a better teammate with them. I love that. I'm
Yeah.
wondering, oh, sorry, go ahead, Evan.
No, I was just gonna add, the a couple of things. I would add emotional intelligence, right? Which may sound kind of lofty, um, and maybe like therapy talk, but the specific thing I'm invoking is that like understanding how other people think and feel as they're going through the experiences of life, is both a hard and a soft skill, right? Like if you have the intelligence to know when to engage with empathy or doubt, if you can figure those things out for yourself and other people, you can probably figure them out for a character in a story, right? How to set it up, right? Like you watch, I don't know if anybody's watching Severance, but like I'm from the first episode of this new season. Um, I said to my partner, I was like, yeah, this is gonna mean X because the way this character is talking about their experiences is a perfect setup to create doubt or confusion. Um, and that's you've had somebody sit across from you and tell lies, and you're like, something's not right here. And you can learn how to set that up in a piece of fiction that you're creating. So that's one thing. But we've all kind of given soft skill answers. I'd say the hard skill stuff. Well, I'll say this generally about hard skills. They're generally things you can learn in a book about narrative design or game writing, right? They're generally things you can learn from a tutorial on YouTube or TikTok. They're generally things you can learn by interfacing with people with more experience, right? Or just putting in the reps, putting in the cycles over and over again of here's what it means to um, update display text in Unreal, right? Uh, I will say for our discipline of narrative design, thinking about whether a story needs to branch and how to branch, right? We've all played games where like you have multiple choice and depending on your choice, you get different outcomes. Like that's stuff you can figure out um, on Twine, for example, which is a platform that lets you tell interactive stories. It's all text based. You can add more bells and whistles depending on how you want to tell your story. But like that's a good place to be like, yeah, I just want to do like a multi-path adventure. You can't call it what we used to call it when I was growing up because that's a copyrighted term. But let's say you want to choose your own experience throughout a narrative, like Twines is something that lets you do that. So, like in terms of hard skills, you can almost always pick them up on your own, and you can kind of self-tutor in some of that stuff. The soft skills where you're engaging with other people, I've always found like those are the things that are going to help you create a sustainable career.
Very awesome. And that reminds me of something that we had discussed in our prep call. Cameron, you had talked about how to study games and approaching that with a more studious lens. Could you share with our audience more about that kind of practice?
Yeah, sure. It's something that came from my time as a film student, I think, because one of the assignments that we were given is to find a scene that we really love and watch it and transcribe it. So you watch it first, you kind of see how it hits, and then you watch it again and you transcribe as you would if you were writing the screenplay, exactly what's happening on screen. And it's a really helpful tool to internalize, at least for me, all of the different choices that are being made that might feel inevitable or might feel inconsequential as you're watching it, because it all comes together as like one coherent experience, but each one has to be made very consciously. So I would say, if there is a game that you really love or one that you think really sucks, play some of it and then take notation on what's happening. Okay, so I wake up disoriented and there's a cutscene, and then the character stands up and goes over to a mirror and looks in the mirror and presses like X or something to say something about themselves. So write each one of those steps down, and then also be reflecting on how it made you feel. Were you interested? Were you bored? Were you curious? Were you afraid? I think horror games honestly are really awesome for as a starting point, because they're so I want to be careful. I'm going to say blunt, but it's not because I think that is a bad thing, but they are very forceful about pushing a specific feeling onto the audience. And so, I think if you want a genre that's kind of easy to take notes on, I would try horror. Um, so that's one suggestion that I have. Yeah.
I think it's a really good idea, and I want to also add that I think you said also play games that you think suck, and I think that's a hugely important thing. Like I think it's play different kinds of games, play because I think there's so much to learn from different experiences, different ways of telling stories, different ways of playing, whether you are playing Fortnite, you are playing Call of Duty, you are playing, I don't know, Peppa Pig, you are playing whatever game across, like those are three games that exist. But whatever they are, you will learn something from them, because even something that is kind of like out there or completely different from my own like usual tastes has taught me like, oh, I didn't think about that trick. And often the thing with game design is like you can take a small element or one single mechanic or one single kind of trick that somebody pulls, and you can put that into your game and get a very different experience out of it. So I really encourage people. Like I played a game called Paranormal Sight. I'm not usually a visual novel person. I usually don't get involved with them, but I said, you know what, I'm working on something kind of similar. Let me dive in, and I understand so much more by virtue of just having done that. And now I'm like, oh, okay, I should try this. I should try that. I recommended Obra Dinn to Cameron, which is a phenomenal like mystery game that tells its story in a way that's one very unusual and very specific, but that I learned so much about like environmental storytelling and the ways that we can kind of like leave clues in an environment. And so it doesn't matter if I'm not working on something that is like that. Just having kind of like a book full of references in my mind is super helpful. And actually, my co-founder, he plays he plays so many games, but he will play them for like 15 minutes to like a couple hours, and then go, okay, I think I get it, and then he'll just go to a next one because he just wants to learn what everybody's doing. And so we'll be in meetings, and someone will say, I'm kind of thinking about this mechanic, and he will pull like, oh yeah, this Japanese game from like 1996 that like 9 people played on like a console that doesn't exist. And he's like, yeah, we'll just do that. And I'm like, damn, that's great. And it really, really, I think helps in getting those conversations, because it gives you just more common ground to speak to with other people as you're creating.
I love that. It's so helpful to expand your personal, I don't know, like encyclopedia. I forget what term you used, Kim, of the games that exist out there. It just makes you way more knowledgeable. And to Evan's point too, just also understanding how all the elements work in tandem to each other too.
I would I think the last thing I would say is I personally had really good experiences with game jams, particularly the short ones. So they're all because of the pandemic. I think a lot of things moved online, which is good and bad. I think there's a benefit to being in an isolated physical space with a team, but then that also means that there are a lot of ways that you can collaborate online. And some of them are shorter, some of them are longer. I If I had to give advice, I would say go for a more limited time frame. The longer ones, I think, tend to then become a project, which can be abandoned. And one of the benefits of a game jam is that you kind of have to finish it in a certain amount of time. Um, but yeah, like volunteering, the stakes are really low. Volunteering for a kind of game that you haven't written for before or designed before. Um, Getting, if you meet people at a meetup or something, inviting them to do the game jam with you and see like, hey, what could we make? Maybe you'll find some surprises there. But that's one of the ways that I was able to work my way into the industry from another angle.
That's great. And that also speaks to, the soft skills too. Like you're training those communication, collaboration, teamwork skills. And Evan, I remember you saying in our pre-call too, narrative design is something that you train at, right? It's not something that you just can study one off and just be great at necessarily.
Yeah, because all these studios will wind up being different working experiences, right? So like even if it's like, let's take a big franchise like Kim mentioned, Call of Duty. Like at one point in time, 3, 4 studios were making Call of Duty games, right? Like, and yeah, they're kind of siloed in different franchises. One of them is Black Ops, one of them is this, that, whatever, Warzone. Um, but even though they're all working in the same franchise with the same genre, right? First person, they could all work very differently, right? So, uh, and I found this much to be much the same in journalism, right? Like I studied journalism in college, but once you actually have to do it, that's when I really started to learn how to do the job, right? So, um, you know, accounting for the differences in different studios or different teams is something that's gonna be really important, but also like knowing what you bring to the table um, is gonna be the key to starting and maintaining a career. Like the three of us on this panel have very different paths. Where we started, um, but my first gig on consulting was on a superhero game. It was the first Insomniac game that Spider-Man did, and they asked me for one line of dialogue, but they knew I could deliver that one line of dialogue just based on my career as a journalist and the things I wrote about and cared about. And my comic book writing, like they knew I could do that. And then when it came time for them to start on the Miles Morales game, they reached back out to me again and was like, "Hey, okay, we know you can do this. We need more of that in here." Um, so there's a thin line between being self-assured and overconfident and obnoxious, right? So you never want to be the person with all the answers because to go back to the soft skills stuff and collaboration, like nobody likes working with that person with all the who thinks they have all the answers. Um, but really narrative design can happen as much in the negative space of a project as it can in the stuff that has been clearly delineated, right? Negative space is like, oh, here's a drawing, and there's a bunch of stuff in the background where there's either smaller details or no details. Like you can use that stuff to inform the stuff, like I said, that's been clearly drawn, right? So, you know, uh, there's an example that Kim brought up when we were doing the pre-call about um, the different voice readings in the Spider-Man games that Insomniac does, where like there can be some really calm ones where okay, I'm just talking in a normal speaking voice, but when Miles or Peter are swinging, they're like their voices are their breath is shorter, the lines are quicker, they sound like they're doing physical exertion, and that's narrative design. And uh, you don't know if that was something that was explicitly planned out or was something like, hey, you know what would be cool? Like, and it just adds more depth to the experience that they're giving to the player.
I love that story of the voice takes of what is depending on what's happening in the story and which voices are made. Evan, you made a great point about how you infuse, your own personal experience. I want to acknowledge too that, this is a very diverse panel and Brass Line Entertainment, we love on the BRIC side because y'all are known for creating stories that really center those like Black, Brown, other marginalized experiences and voices. I want to understand from you all, like, how do you advocate for and achieve that kind of like authentic storytelling? How do you infuse your own experience, your perspectives to be able to tell those stories specifically and advocate for them with your various clients?
Uh, I have a lot to say here, so I feel we probably all have a lot to say
No,
here.
you
So
start.
okay, like as a journalist and cultural critic, I wrote a lot about representation in media because it obviously matters to me. Um, it feels like so like trite to say it now, but I think it's important to say and restate because um look, the cultural climate of the world we live in um is often hostile to people of color and marginalized people and growing more hostile depending on where you live. So it's going to be important even when um, it makes you a target, And unfortunately, all of us on this panel have experienced that. I don't want to dwell on that. But for me, it's about like how somebody with my lived experience can use that and infuse it in the story so that even if you're people who don't share a same cultural or background in other ways, like they'll recognize that there's some actual um real food here, if I can get like internet meme like for a second. Um, you know, so one example I like to give for when I was working on the Miles Morales game, there's a big scene at the end of essentially the first act, right? Miles is trying to stop the bad guys from stealing something on a bridge, and the bridge blows up. There's an explosion. He has to save people, and the Miles Morales games are very much about like this character is a young Afro Latino man, and what is that? How does his experience different from Peter's in moving through the world, right? And you're playing the Miles Morales game, and he's in a superhero suit. It covers his whole body, um, and you don't know that this kid on there is like black and Puerto Rican. And one of the things I said to the team was we should have his suit show some damage, so his skin can show through. And like my approach on this began with not thinking about racial representation just in terms of the plot logic, right? It's like this game happens in a fictional superhero universe where clones exist. This guy could be the other Spider-Man's son. Like he could be his little brother. So that was like, we need to tell the player that there's a significant difference socioculturally about this character versus the other one who has the same kind of suit, most of the same powers, and does a lot of the same stuff. Like, what makes him different? How can we show that? And then, you know, uh, once we kind of all aligned on that decision and made it happen, the next thing was okay. Well, metaphorically, thematically, how can we make this revelation resonate even more? And the scene was already set where like the bad guys had their guns on Miles and they're kind of like a paramilitary outfit, so they could easily be read to stand in for the police. But like that scene gets a whole different kind of energy once Miles' skin is showing, right? And he literally says the line, I didn't do anything, or I was just trying to help. So to have all those elements come together, like was definitely me drawing on, hey, I'm a black man, and when I walk into a social, frame, like people can have preconceptions about me just based on the way I look. They're probably gonna have the same kind of preconceptions about Miles, especially if he's a young Afro Latino kid running around with superpowers, and in the middle of a disaster. They might try to find a way to pin the blame on him. So um, that's what it is. Who you are, what you've experienced, and you don't have to make everything like extremely didactic and on the nose, right? But if you can add a little bit of nuance where it hadn't been designed before by virtue of the stuff you know from your culture and your background or the way you move through the world, then that's storytelling. And that's storytelling that maybe only you can do and not other people on the project can't tap into that stuff. You can, at the risk of being a little bit too spicy, you can tell when it's fake. I've
Mhm.
played games where it's been fake. I play game. I'm a Haitian American, and I play games with Haitians in them. I'm like, ain't no Haitian touch that game. Like no Haitian has talked to these people about what our lives are. Um, and that sucks, but it also motivates me to keep working and make other kinds of representation manifest in this business.
That's awesome. And I love that, like, that storytelling through nuance and the fact that you all as narrative designers are some of the key people that are like in charge of what that nuance is and how much of it you can sprinkle in is so amazing.
And don't get me wrong, like there are times narrative design is also deciding when to be heavy-handed and when
Mhm.
to approach with a lighter touch.
Love that. Cameron, anything else you wanted to add to that as well?
Yeah, I
Oh,
would
good.
say so I'm currently playing Thousand Times Resist, which I'm really loving, no surprise. And something that they do well is they've realized you don't need to make everything a choice, that making something a choice, making everything interactive does not necessarily increase player engagement. In fact, especially if you need the character to do something, it's probably better that you don't make it a choice, or that if you are giving them dialogue options, that it's for flavor rather than for branching and, taking the narrative into two different directions. So, I'm not going to give any spoilers, but there's some pretty consequential um, questions that are asked of the main character in A Thousand Times Resist. And I anticipate that, oh, they're going to make me choose, but no, they don't, because they want you to align as closely with this character as you can. And so they take that control out of your hands in what is otherwise a very fluid and responsive experience. And they're just like, no, we're actually going to have her say yes to this question. And that's because this is as tightly glued as we've decided you should be to her as a person. And I really appreciate that, because I think otherwise it can either feel a little bit like you are confusing a choice with satisfying engagement. And then I think other times you can paint yourself into a little bit of a, a swamp of too many branches if you decide that everything needs to be um, left to the player to figure out. Anyway, that's just something that occurred to me, as I can't remember what it was exactly that you said, Evan, but it was something I was like, oh yeah, uh, you can be judicious with when you employ a significant choice in a video game.
Awesome. And that I know we don't have a ton of time left. We have about 5 minutes left. And thank you, Kim and team, for answering some of these Q&As along the way. I did want to ask too about, you hinted at it a little bit, Cameron, with like the challenges that you've had to overcome and like the boxes that you have to work within, the confines and things. Um, can you tell our audience an example of like how other ways that you've overcome some of those challenges to still capture your initial vision?
Sorry, maybe I didn't quite understand the question. Like an instance where the narrative team had a specific vision that was difficult to convey, maybe, or do you mean
Yes.
okay. Uh yeah, that's a good question. Definitely there have been moments. I can think of one in particular. Don't need to get into the specifics of the game, but it was a situation where the identity of the characters was fairly important that we get it right. Um, and we were brought in, I would say, like what should have been a little bit later into the project, but uh, they were questioning a lot of their initial decisions. And so we were luckily in a place where we could have real impact. I think at that stage in production, it from what I've seen, would usually be a little bit more rare to be able to change things that profoundly. But so in this case, it didn't look like what I was used to, which is like sending pitch documents to maybe different department leads or having one-on-one meetings with different department, like you might, if you have a specific, oh, we would really like her hair to be in cornrows, so maybe you would have a meeting with the art lead and just kind of like talk through those things. Um, and in this situation, we actually had to have a more heart to heart, really foundational conversation about these are some of the experiences that you are necessarily going to invoke, or some of the messages that you are going to invoke, some of the implications you are going to invoke, regardless of whether you want to or not. It's not a question of like, are you doing it well? Are you doing it badly? It's just, it's there. And so here are the options for how that could go. And this was a pretty, I would say, like unique situation where they were willing to take days out of their time to talk with us about it. And yeah, it was informative. Um, I think in the end, the result was quite positive. But sometimes it comes back to communication and doing that translation of like understanding what the other person cares about. You know what you care about, but why should they care? Um, and I think in that situation, it was as a marginalized person, I felt making myself very vulnerable and being brutally honest of just like, hey, I think what you're doing is not cool. And then being met with a less than optimal response to that, and then having to say it again, and then again and again. Um, so what I would take out of that, what I have taken out of that in hindsight is know where your personal and professional limit is. Um, choose your battles. Decide as much as you can which hills you're willing to die on and which, maybe you would rather not. Um, I think that really will serve you well, and get very specific about your priorities. Um, be willing to let certain things go, maybe. But that comes with experience. That's not something that I knew in the moment. Um, I think in hindsight, I will say I wish I had been a little less vulnerable. Uh, and so that is a very valuable piece of information that I now have about myself, and about that process. So yeah, did that answer the question? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it did and more. So thank you for sharing that, Cameron. Evan?
I just, yeah, I just want to add to what Cameron said. Like one of the things that's really hard, and I certainly did not get told in at any of the various stages of the careers that I've had, you're not going to win every battle. That's the thing. You're not going to win every battle, right? And like figuring out where to put your energy is going to be really important in any kind of professional development. And as Cameron was talking, like it's something else that you have to learn by experience rather than like by training is find your people, you know? Like I'm lucky enough to count like Kim and Cameron as my friends, and we've all gone through experiences since we've known each other where like if I didn't have them to vent to or build with or be like, "Hey, can I get a gut check on this? Maybe I'm too close to this and maybe I need to know is this person wilding out? Like is it me?" Um and they're also the kinds of honest colleagues where like, yeah, you're tripping, let it go. Or like, nah, they're on some bullshit. Sorry, I'm cussing, but we're over time, so I feel like I'm allowed. Um, but yeah, no, finding your people because not only do you get that kind of like psychological and emotional support um, from having a community that you can reference, like there's also professional benefits too, like you know, just working in community with these two people has made me a better writer and narrative designer for sure, you know. And when I do have those moments of self-doubt, like I can turn to them and be like, hey, I'm not sure, maybe we should do it this way, or like, we work very collaboratively. We work on a project together, and it's not like I'm the big guy who's in charge because I'm in house at the studio. It's like, no, like all ideas are welcome. Um, and that's important because you're not always going to be working in environments where that's the case. Sometimes you will be working in environments where like the flow of ideas and responsibilities is very unilateral. It sits with in one position in an organization and everybody else follows that. Um, and that can be frustrating. And a way to deal with the frustration is to, like I said, find your people and also remember you're not going to win every battle, but the ones that are really meaningful, figure out multi-pronged, like valent strategies. Like, okay, well, maybe they don't want to listen to me because of whatever. They just don't like, you know, the gray in my beard. So like you send somebody who's clean shaven to make the argument. I'm joking, but yeah.
Yeah. I just want to, yeah, like agree hugely with that, and with Cameron, and just to say that like having now worked, like again, I say this with the privilege of having worked on a lot of things, but I say having worked on a lot of things and nearly 100 projects, no project is worth it if the team isn't worth working with. Like the people that you work with are everything. The people that you consider your colleagues, your friends, your community, pick them no matter what over whatever cool project, because the biggest learning for me is that there have been projects that I have worked on that I have thought, wow, this is going to be a game that I am so deep into. I love the fantasy of it. I love the characters in it. And working on it has been pure hell, has been, like egotistical personalities, toxicity in the workplace, like siloing, keeping people out of discussions, like and all the and like ridiculous deadlines, and all of a sudden that dream project is like, oh, I don't care what happens to this anymore because no one in this team is being kind to me, or no one is being kind to each other. Like there was another project we worked on that was with a big company, and I remember it was the first one ever years ago that we actually stepped away from because we would get into meetings and people were straight up yelling at each other. Like people were like like there was a point where we asked the producer, like, should we be in these because we're like external to the studio and maybe we shouldn't see that. He's like, oh, no, it's fine. It's just they're being guys. And we were like, oh, yeah, we can't do that. And situation, and again, that was a really cool game. And there have been other games that I kind of go on and go like, okay, yeah, sure, we can figure this out, like whatever. But then I work with the team and I see their passion. I understand why they're making this. And I start going like, oh, I'm thinking about it in the shower in the morning. I'm thinking about when I'm walking the dog. I was like, I'm going out focused on this game that I thought I wouldn't care about simply because the excitement of being in a room with these other people as we work it out is so fun. Like before this call, like we had a chat just internally, and we were like I was having a rough day, and we talked it through with the team, and we put aside work for a little bit and said, oh, let's just hash it out, and we had a great time by the end of it. And that's important. So I think that like for all of this being about work, like it's still your life. There is no such thing as a dream project. A lot of the studios that are making really cool stuff, like they will shed teams. So the team that makes the sequel or the third, the third entry to it are not even the same team that made the first one. And that can be for good or for ill, but what it really means to me is it's just like it is all people. And so really, really like find people that you like to work with. Doesn't matter what you're making, it will be a better experience than making something with people who don't care about you.
That's fantastic advice. And I want to thank you, Kim, Evan, and Cameron, for those perfect parting words, I think, to round out the end of this webinar, which I know we've gone over on. So thank you for your time and staying, and thank you to our attendees for staying as well. I did want to give you all a chance to share, your information, how folks can contact you in this chat for any future advice, any follow-up questions on what was said today. So definitely, please feel free to share that in the chat. If there are any other parting words of wisdom speak now, forever hold your peace. Otherwise, thank you all for joining us on the speaker series. It was so great to learn more about the narrative design process, what goes on behind the scenes when it comes to crafting all of these nuances and features of gameplay.
Yeah,
Thank you for having
Yeah,
us,
thank you so
Sarah.
much. It's been really wonderful.
And to everybody out there, I hope this was entertaining, fun, insightful. Good luck on your journeys.
Yeah, and feel free to reach out anytime. I put the website in there and also our LinkedIn. So if you have any questions more than this, and yeah, we're happy to help.
Great. And just a reminder for those attending, we will be putting up this recording on our speaker series webpage. So if you want to rewatch it, it'll be available there specifically. But thank you all for joining us this Tuesday. Our BRIC Summit is our next big event that's coming up on March 21 and 22, March 21st and 22nd. I don't know why I said it like that. The March 22nd date will be all virtual, and we'll have more panels just like this where you can learn more about all the different careers and specialties that exist across animation, VFX, and gaming. So be sure to sign up for that at our website. So thank you all again for joining, and we hope to see you at the next one.
Hi, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.